Hi everyone. In the last video I was talking about the structure of geopolitics. In this video I'm going to be talking about the direct effect it has on the societies that we actually live in, as the nature of events which come down through international politics, through the international centres of power, are all part of the geopolitical framework. But the whole thing about the way the postmodern age was created after World War II meant that it had to work in a particular way, as the UN system had to ensure lasting peace, and another revolution starting in the middle of that could have destabilized the whole situation. But now we have the problem of people not understanding the big picture, as they don't believe it's possible or that they're not supposed to, even though the world system is now stable enough for this to happen, and it would actually be beneficial if they did. In the last video, I showed that we can do very little about the overall structure of global society as individuals, in particular because of the relationship between nations and the UN. However, as this framework makes up the structure of our current age, what I'm going to do in this video is look at where we are now and see how we're going to move into the Anthropocene from where we are today. So in the next video, I'm going to be looking at what we can do to be better adapted as the shift to a more objective perspective is coming with the Anthropocene. And this will mean more people need to realize what's happening because they're going to get left behind. As more people now are realizing that global civilization is opening up, governments are becoming more transparent, and that they can understand how it all works in a way that they couldn't do, for example, during the Cold War. So we can see the proportions of recent events evolving in relation to the Cold War period as that ended, then the post-Cold War period made the US the main superpower, then the problem of terrorism occurred and the war on terror led to the multipolar political environment. Then there was the renegotiation of the relationship between capitalist and communist nations during the North Korean nuclear crisis, and the BRICS alliance now, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is beginning to properly counterbalance Western influence worldwide with its developmentalist policies for developing nations, such as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the String of Pearls plan. Then there was the 2021 COVID pandemic, and the public lockdown of most nations caused an economic crisis before it was ended with the introduction of vaccines. Shortly after that, Russia invaded Ukraine, causing the next global crisis, and that's where we are now in mid-2022. So let's analyze this situation in terms of where we are now in terms of the structure of our current age. Since the start, Western nations have poured support into Ukraine in the form of money, military intelligence, and training, food supplies and weaponries, while Russia calls it a special military operation. Various nations, such as India, have been mixing other types of oil with the Russians to avoid trade sanctions on purely Russian oil. Russia claims to have been surrounded by NATO countries since the end of the Soviet Union, and that has created an existential threat on its borders, giving it no room to maneuver politically. And considering Russia is the only superpower in both East and West, it tends to hold the balance of power between them. However, while Russia and China have recently been conducting joint military exercises, there has been talk of Ukraine joining NATO and the EU. So we've got not just a conflict of interest on both sides, but we've got a different sets of alliances on both sides. Both sides, Russia and Ukraine, claim to have a rational argument, but with opposing ambitions. Both have broken international law and been antagonistic towards each other, and I'll explain why that is later. But where important issues have not been resolved, this has allowed the situation to escalate into a bigger problem. Russia, with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, has chosen to act autonomously, as they were able to veto the advice of other nations. But should it be up to Ukraine, as the smaller nation, to appease them? The history of the situation plays an important role in this, as while Ukraine became a pro-Western democracy in recent years, having overthrown its pro-Russian government in 2014 and aligned itself with the EU, this resulted in pro-Russian separatists declaring independent regions in the eastern Donbass area, causing an ongoing civil war, while they called on Russia for support. This is when political analysts say Russia should have intervened, but didn't. Russia then became increasingly worried about an agreement with Ukraine over the Sevastopol port in Crimea, which has been home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet for over 100 years, and annexed Crimea by forcefully taking over its parliament with unmarked soldiers and announcing a referendum to join Russia, which was subsequently declared invalid by the UN General Assembly by a vote of nations. Ukraine then retaliated by cutting off the water supply to Crimea by building a dam which caused widespread drought and famine, which Russia took Ukraine to court over. But having then become the occupying power in legal terms, Russia was then forced to supply water to the region. Then there was talk of Ukraine joining NATO, which is when Russia then claimed it had an existential threat on its borders and invaded the whole Ukraine. It was said that they could have intervened in the Donbass region, stopped the civil war, and claimed the area for themselves, but they invaded the whole country. Some analysts have claimed that this was to draw Ukrainian forces away from the Donbass region with an attack on Kiev and other important cities, but it also drew international condemnation and accusations of genocide. One of the first things they did was to destroy the dam and claim Ukraine had strategically used civilians to protect their army, while the West accused Russia of returning to imperialism and wanting to restore the power of the Soviet Union. Russia is saying that even thousands have died. It is nothing like the million who died during the US invasion of Iraq. So what is happening at the UN if it is Russia's seat on the Security Council, which gave it the power to act autonomously? The Council itself was set up using 5 major powers who were victorious when World War II ended in 1945: Russia, the US, the UK, China and France, to ensure a lasting peace. But various nations have been proposing reform to its structure for approximately 25 years, and numerous ideas have been proposed. These include calls for the expansion of the permanent seats from the G4 nations, of which Germany and Japan are members, while Uniting for Consensus movement includes Italy, Spain, Argentina, and Turkey. They suggest a rotation of the Council's membership and an end to the Big Five's privileged status. So in general, the idea of some kind of reform is supported now by the UN President. Dissolving the core structure, which is the backbone of the postmodern age. So the question really is over the time scale this is all happening in. Additional problems exist with these reforms, as the creation of more permanent members could take the world towards a single superstate which could effectively do whatever it wanted, while simply choosing countries on a rotational basis could lead to larger nations coercing developing countries into taking action on their behalf. And what if Chile, for example, was required to please the US when it acted illegally? Hence, the Big Five are still strong, as after World War II, the UN needed to create a lasting peace, so it needed a strong structure. But with the multipolar environment, the division between the major power blocs has been eased, paving the way for a more equal relationship between nations. Now it is more like NATO protectionism for developed Western countries, in competition with the BRICS countries' expansionist investment for developing countries. The spread of nuclear weapons into more countries also means that while the two main superpowers held the balance of power exclusively during the Cold War, now both sides of East and West are effectively keeping themselves stable, with North Korea, India, Pakistan and China in Asia, and the US-led NATO in the West, of which the UK and France are members. However, it looks like the Big Five are going to hold on for some time, as amendments to the present Security Charter can occur if they have been adopted by a vote of 2/3 of the members of the UN General Assembly, including the permanent members of the Security Council. At present, the Big Five do not want to give up their veto rights and permanent seats, and have been criticised for acting rather more in terms of their own interests than of world peace. So things may change suddenly over the crisis in Ukraine, or because of China threatening to invade Taiwan if it declares independence, especially since the US has now proposed retaliatory action, perhaps the UN will intervene at this stage. Now we can see what the problem is with the autonomous nature of the big five, or perhaps we need them. Perhaps we don't need them because of the spread of nuclear weapons. So there again is another issue with the proliferation of nuclear weapons into Asia and Europe. And perhaps the reason for it is all part of a bigger plan. So anyway, this is the thing to watch out for right now. It may happen over sweeping reforms which take effect alongside new measures, or it could be further down the line due to something that we cannot predict right now. But the thing to watch out for is reform to the UN Security Council, because it created the backbone of postmodernity, and hence a fundamental reform to it would dissolve that structure and it would point to an end of this age. So we can see more about the current world order by looking at the UN organization as a whole. It has 5 core units: the General Assembly, where the world's nations, the Security Council, which is responsible for world peace, and also admitting new members to the General Assembly and approving changes to the UN Charter. So that's why it's incredibly important, because it has other functions as well. There's the International Court of Justice, which settles disputes between nations according to international law. The Secretariat, which is responsible for the decision-making process running through the organization as a whole. And the Economic and Social Council, which is responsible for coordinating the activities of its 15 specialized agencies, which work autonomously throughout the world. These agencies currently include the World Food Programme, the Children's Fund, the Development Programme, the Office on Drugs and Crime, Women's Affairs, the International Labour Organization, the Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, the World Health Organization, World Bank, the Environment Programme, the Industrial Development Organization, the World Tourism Organization, Universal Postal Union, International Monetary Fund, World Intellectual Property Organization, the World Meteorological Organization, International Telecommunications Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, International Fund for Agricultural Development, High Commission on Refugees, International Maritime Organization, and the International Atomic Energy Agency. Some of them were created before World War II, some of them were part of the League of Nations, some were created before World War I even, and others were created by the UN in response to its changing needs. For example, the United Nations Trusteeship Council was established to ensure that territories held in trust by other nations were administrated in the best interests of their inhabitants. Most of these were League of Nations mandates or taken away from occupying forces at the end of World War II. This suspended operations in 1994 as it was no longer required, while new initiatives appeared. So as you can see, the world is being managed according to its current needs, thus allowing for feedback to occur between the different levels of the system. But while this helps us to cope with now, it also prevents any form of radical change from occurring. And this is what I believe caused the problem of terrorism to emerge out of the structure of the situation, because the structure of the situation was managed in a particular way, and even though it polarized the Middle East, it couldn't change. So gradually the pressure, I think, built up as if you appreciate the whole total product of all the civilizations which had ever evolved out of Africa, then started to push back across that into that space. It was pushing back on the actual current of human evolution itself, and caused a radical bubble to appear, which hence then exploded in the form of geopolitics. So that's also why the multipolar political environment was then found to be the solution at the UN, because the way the situation had worked is what had caused the problem. So this is that I'm saying the problem with the structure of postmodernity. It is that fundamental in terms of the framework of international relations. And that's what we're trying to solve now. So having been through the multipolar period, we're now looking for to improve on the situation we have now, and that's essentially what's leading to the Anthropocene. So it looks like, I mean, right now the Ukraine is raising the issue of the ability of the big five nations on the Security Council to act autonomously. So perhaps the most important change then the external proceeding will bring is that at some point people will realize that the structure of the age is always the root of our problems, and as well as the reason for our successes. And things will then change as we learn to manage that in a way that we have never seen before.